Okay, so today we're diving into a pretty big question. What makes a society fair? Just. And we're going to be looking at it through the lens of a really influential philosopher, John Rawls, specifically as it's presented in Michael Sandel's Justice. You sent in some really interesting stuff touching on Rawls' main ideas, like his hypothetical social contract and the fascinating idea of veil of ignorance, but also, some of the criticisms that have been leveled against it, especially when it comes to merit and incentive. So I guess our mission today is to kind of unpack these really powerful ideas and see what they tell us about building a fair social order. I mean, that's a pretty big task.
Yeah, definitely. It's a huge question, right? We're not just defining words here. It's about like the foundation of how we live together. And right at the heart of Rawls' thinking is this idea of a social contract. But we need to be clear. Rawls wasn't talking about some like historical event where everyone got together and signed a piece of paper. He's asking us to imagine a hypothetical agreement.
Right, right.
And this is different from, say, John Locke, who thought about consent as something we kind of give just by being part of society. It goes beyond Kant's idea of an agreement based on pure reason, too. Rawls adds a really specific condition to this hypothetical agreement.
Which is, like, totally key, the veil of ignorance. So imagine this. You're in a position to decide the fundamental rules for a whole society, the laws, economics, everything, right? But here's the twist. You have absolutely no clue who you'll be in that society. You don't know if you'll be rich or poor, your race, gender, talents, even your values, aspirations.
Exactly. That's the genius of it. It forces us to be impartial. We can't rig the system in our favor because we don't know what our favor even is. Behind that veil, ending up disadvantaged is a real possibility. Suddenly you're not so keen on, creating a society where some groups are systematically marginalized. You might be one of them. The whole point is that this leads to principles that protect everyone's basic interests.
And Rawls argues that from this starting point, two main principles of justice would emerge. The first one, and this is the most important one, is equal basic liberties for everyone. The freedoms we usually think about in a democracy: speech, religion, assembly, right to a fair trial.
Right. And the second principle is all about social and economic inequality. Now, Rawls isn't saying everyone should have exactly the same amount of money. He gets that some inequality can be good. Maybe it leads to more productivity, more innovation. But this second principle has two key parts. One, any inequalities have to benefit the least well-off. This is the famous difference principle, the idea that those at the bottom should be a top priority when we design our institutions.
Yeah, that's a big one.
And two, these inequalities are only okay if they're attached to positions and offices that are open to everyone under fair conditions.
Right.
And by fair conditions, as we touched on earlier, it's not just saying, well, anyone could be a CEO. It's making sure everyone has a real shot at developing their talents and competing regardless of their background.
So it's really leveling the playing field.
Yeah.
Now, this brings up something interesting about real-world agreements. Contracts. We sign them all the time, but what makes them morally binding? Is consent always enough? I mean, you might agree to something you later regret from
That's a really important point.
Yeah.
And Rawls' hypothetical contract helps us see that just saying yes doesn't always mean something is morally right. Think about those situations where people agree to things out of desperation or because they don't have all the information. Like, imagine someone's about to be evicted. They might agree to a loan with terrible terms just to keep a roof over their head. Sure, they consented, but is it really fair? So Rawls is saying that a just society needs a stronger base than just agreements made under pressure. It has to be built on fairness principles that we choose from that impartial position behind the veil.
And you had some great examples that show how tricky this can be, like that lobster buyer who agrees to a set price, but then the market crashes. They might be kicking themselves, but that initial consent usually holds, right?
Right. They took on that risk. The obligation comes from that agreement, even when things change. But compare that to a shady contractor who takes a huge upfront payment from, say, an elderly person, then does a terrible job or doesn't even finish.
Yeah.
There was consent, yeah, but the unfairness of it makes you question whether the contractor was morally in the right, even if they technically followed the contract. They weren't acting in good faith.
And then there's that classic example of Hume and the squeegee men. He paid a contractor who didn't do the work he was hired for a clear breach of contract. But then you have these guys who wash his windshield without asking, then demand money.
Yeah, totally different situation.
There was no atonement beforehand.
No.
So it highlights the difference between an obligation coming from an agreement, even a loose one, and just demanding payment for something you didn't ask for.
Right. And that story about Sam's mobile repair van, where the guy feels obligated to pay even though the repair was tiny, well, it shows how complicated these feelings of obligation can be, especially when someone's helping you out. Even if it's not all spelled out, we're kind of wired to want to reciprocate, even without a formal contract.
Yeah, that makes sense. And all these examples show how real-world contracts can get messy, right? Power imbalances, information gaps, just plain bad luck. This is where Rawls' idea of that hypothetical contract behind the veil of ignorance gets really interesting. It takes all that real-world inequality and those information gaps out of the equation. It's saying that a truly just society shouldn't be based on these accidental advantages or disadvantages that people just happen to have.
Which brings us to Rawls' argument against what he calls moral arbitrariness. He's saying that so much of what determines our success, our talents, our families, our opportunities is ultimately just chance, things we didn't earn. So a just society shouldn't meanly reward people based on these things they have no control over.
Right. But doesn't that kind of mess with incentives? One of the big arguments against Rawls is that if you redistribute wealth to help the least well-off, won't that make talented people less motivated? I mean, why work hard and innovate if a big chunk of the reward is going to be, redistributed?
Yeah, it's a valid concern. But Rawls actually addresses this head-on. He says differences in income are okay as long as they ultimately help the least advantaged. So like a CEO who builds a successful company and creates jobs, maybe they deserve a higher salary if that activity ends up lifting those at the bottom. The key is that the inequality has to serve a purpose, not just be about the wealthy getting wealthier with no benefit trickling down.
And what about effort? A lot of people believe we should be rewarded for how hard we work. Rawls seems to kind of downplay that, right? What's thinking there?
Rawls definitely sees the value of hard work. People who put in the effort should be rewarded, that's fair. But he's also saying that our capacity for effort is shaped by things we don't control. Think about it. Someone growing up with stability, good education, healthcare, they'll probably develop a stronger ability to work hard than someone facing constant stress, adversity. So effort matters, but it's not entirely self-made. It shouldn't be the only basis for reward in a just society. Even our ability to put in effort is partly due to luck.
And this ties into his kind of controversial view on what people deserve. It's not that Rawls thinks nobody deserves anything, but he has a different view on moral desert.
Right. Yeah. He says we definitely deserve the rewards that ageist society promises for our work and talents. Like if the system says you get paid for your job, you deserve that pay. But we don't inherently deserve those talents or the advantages they bring. It's like winning the lottery or, a sports team winning a championship. Sure, they get the prize. They probably worked really hard. But there's also natural ability, luck, being in the right place at the right time. It's not all about some pure moral deservingness of those advantages.
It's clear when you look at the huge pay gap between different jobs, like a school teacher versus, say, a late-night talk show host versus a top lawyer. For Rawls, all those jobs contribute to society, but that massive difference in income would have to be justified by whether it actually helps those at the bottom.
Right. Does that talk show host earning millions more than a teacher actually improve the lives of the least well-off? It's the kind of question Rawls is pushing us to ask.
Yeah. And you know that Woody Allen story about the comedian who feels unappreciated compared to a garbage collector? It's funny, but it shows how we decide what we value, what deserves a big reward, is pretty arbitrary, right? Our society puts a high price on certain kinds of entertainment, so those people get huge salaries. But essential jobs may be less glamorous. They might get paid way less. Rawls is challenging us to think about those values.
Absolutely.
And it's like people say all the time, life isn't fair, right? And in a lot of ways, that's totally true. But Rawls isn't trying to make life fair in some cosmic sense. It's about trying to design a just society, even with those built-in inequalities. It's about making sure the basic structure of society works to lessen the impact of those arbitrary advantages and disadvantages. We hear a lot about free markets, individual initiative. How does Rawls fit into that?
That's important. Rawls sees the potential of markets, for creating wealth, being efficient. But he doesn't think a completely free market will automatically be just. He says the basic structure of society, the laws, the economic system, those need to be designed according to his principles before the market even comes into play. That way, any inequalities that happen are within acceptable limits and actually benefit the least well-off. So it's not about getting rid of markets. It's about making sure they operate within a fair framework. And like we talked about earlier, even in a system with equal opportunity, natural talent still plays a huge role. And that, again, is something we don't inherently deserve.
And that makes Kurt Vonnegut's story, Harrison Bergeron, so interesting, even though it's kind of extreme. It's set in this dystopian future where everyone is forced to be equal. The government actually handicaps talented people to bring them down to everyone else's level. And Harrison Bergeron, this incredibly gifted guy, rebels against it.
Yeah, it's a powerful story. And it makes you think about what happens when you try to enforce equality in a way that crushes individual potential. Rawls wants to reduce the impact of those unfair inequalities, but it's definitely not saying we should suppress talent or force everyone to be the same. Harrison Bergeron is a warning about taking things too far. The difference with Rawls is that his difference principle says inequalities are okay if they help everyone, including those at the bottom, maybe through innovation, productivity, things like that. It's about lifting everyone up, not dragging the top down.
So when we think about all these different ways that a society could distribute its benefits and burdens, the stuff you sent in talks about 4 main approaches. Can you give us a quick rundown of those different theories?
Sure. First, there's the feudal system, or caste system.
Yeah.
Your place in society is determined by birth, your opportunities, your social standing. It's basically fixed. Second, there's libertarianism. It's all about the free market with formal equality of opportunity. Everyone theoretically has the same legal right to succeed, and there's minimal government interference. Third, we have meritocracy. It combines the free market with what's supposed to be fair equality of opportunity. It tries to make sure everyone has a genuine chance to compete based on their abilities. And finally, there's egalitarianism. Rawls' difference principle is a good example of this. Inequalities are allowed, but only if they ultimately benefit the least advantaged.
So wrapping up our deep dive, let's go back to Rawls' core ideas. We talked about his hypothetical social contract, that idea of imagining ourselves behind a veil of ignorance, not knowing our place in society. And that leads to his 2 principles of justice. First, equal basic liberties for everyone. Second, social and economic inequalities are only okay if they help those at the bottom and are linked to opportunities that are open to everyone under fair conditions. And we also dug into how Rawls challenges those traditional ideas of meritocracy and whether we really deserve our talents and the rewards that come with them.
And it's important to remember that Rawls isn't talking about creating a perfectly equal society. It's about setting up a basic framework of fairness for how society is structured, even with those inequalities that are always going to be there. His work gives us a really powerful way to look at our social and economic systems, to think about the ethics of how we distribute resources and opportunities.
So as you keep thinking about all this, our listener, think about this. If you had no idea where you'd end up in society, your social class, your abilities, your privileges, what would worry you the most about our current system? What would you be most eager to change before that veil of ignorance was lifted? What does that gut feeling tell you about your own sense of justice?
It's a tough question, but it really gets at the heart of Rawls's ideas. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.